welcome everyone that's here and those of you who are watching on your computers at home via live streaming. I'm Kathy Newcomer. I am the director of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And on behalf of our school and George Washington University and the School of Media and Public Affairs, who is our co-host tonight, I welcome you to the first of a series of conversations to find common ground on important public policy issues that are going to confront the next administration. We're very proud to bring to the policy community a series of conversations on important issues that feature bipartisan representatives talking about the important issues in very concrete and civil discourse, and so we're excited to talk about not only the problems and the challenges, but the solutions. So I'm delighted to be here tonight in our first series, which is going to be talking about the environment and climate change. This evening, our conversation will be guided by my faculty colleague, Frank Sesno. Frank Sesno is the director of the School and Media and Public Affairs here at GW, and where he is a wonderful leader and teacher, but he also has a very long and distinguished career as a political journalist, where he is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who has, for example, worked for CNN for many years, over 21 years, where he served as a White House correspondent, anchor, and Washington bureau chief. Since being here, he is involved in a variety of very interesting projects, one of which is very pertinent to tonight, though, that is he started planetforward.org, which is a user-driven web and television project that highlights innovations in sustainability and has brought a lot of really great attention to sustainability from a variety of arenas. It's my pleasure to introduce Frank, my faculty colleague, and he will introduce our two speakers tonight that I'm just delighted and looking forward to hearing from. Thank you all for being here, both in person and via the web. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you to the Trachtenberg School and all the great work you do. And thanks to all of you for coming down from New Hampshire, back from the primary, to join us this evening. We're grateful that you're here, having left your candidates behind. I would like to introduce our wonderful participants and panelists this evening. First with Lynn Scarlett, who is sitting to my left. She's a former Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of the Interior. And she is currently the Global Managing Director for Public Policy at the Nature Conservancy. As part of that role, she is also the Global Climate Strategy Lead for the Nature Conservancy. And Lynn, what does that mean to be the Global Climate Strategy Lead for the Nature Conservancy?
What that means, Frank, is that the Nature Conservancy does see the effects of a changing climate as really challenging our overall conservation mission. We've long done work in forestry and avoided deforestation, but we have thought we needed to up our game a bit, and so I'm trying to coordinate all those efforts across the whole organization.
And the administration that you were part of was?
I was with the G.W. Bush administration, so Republican administration.
Okay, so we're establishing the common ground as we go. Our other guest is joining us now and has had experience in the Obama administration. Mike Boots is the senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, where he advises the Institute and its various philanthropic foundations on the intersection of business and civil society and the environment. Prior to joining Aspen, he led the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where he served as President Obama's primary point person and primary environmental advisor in 2014 and 15. He was responsible for collaborating with members of the cabinet, which I'm sure was really easy to do. And we're really delighted that you're here now. And so within Aspen now, how much and how does environment and climate ripple through your activities?
A lot. So Aspen has a bunch of different programs on a whole set of policy issues. They pride themselves on fostering dialogue on sort of the biggest, thorniest issues of the day. And so there's a whole program on energy and the environment that I'm part of. And I'm also working with their program around innovation and corporate responsibility, looking at businesses who are very active in the issues we're going to talk about tonight.
All right, well, let's dig in. What we're going to do here is we'll have a conversation here on stage for a bit, but then we'll, in about 30 minutes or so, open it up to your questions or thoughts, comments for us to explore. So not long ago, we had Paris, COP21, very dramatic event. Now we're in the middle of politics, as we've seen in recent days, somewhat fewer candidates today than we had before. We invited the candidates here, but Larry David couldn't join us. Bernie Sanders is otherwise booked. We have not heard very much about Paris and climate in the various debates, and least of all on the Republican side. What are you looking for in this political campaign, if anything, from Paris? And how do you think, and we'll come back to all of this in pieces, how substantially is this going to resonate in the next White House? Mike, you want to start us off?
Sure. You're right that there is sort of been a dearth of conversation about this issue on the campaign trail, and in some ways that doesn't surprise me. This hasn't been an issue, if you look at past cycles, that has dominated the conversation among candidates, and yet each of them, regardless of party, comes in, and when it goes from campaigning to governing, this is an issue that is on their plate, and leaders from both parties in the past, and I think into the future, will see this as a growing responsibility on their plate. So I'm not really looking in this campaign cycle to see a lot of sort of what will influence or be influenced by Paris, but I just think the noise level has been turned up a little bit around that circus that's happening around the country right now, that will, at one point in this year, meet up with those folks.
How big an agenda item do you think this is going to be in the next White House? Huge, moderate, modest, non-existent?
So I think regardless of which party comes in, it will be a very big part of the agenda.
Because of Paris?
Sort of because of the trajectory of where this issue has been. If you look really since the George H.W. Bush administration, and the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, and then this one, there's just sort of been a steady rise in the necessity to tackle this issue, the set of stakeholders at all level who are very invested in it, whether Washington is or not. And at the end of the day, you don't really have a choice when you get in there to govern to leave those behind. And so I think regardless of party, this will remain a really important key part of the agenda. What that looks like and how those folks decide to dial up or dial down the level of activity around it will depend on who wins that race.
Lynn, what's your take on this?
Well, I agree with Mike that we are not seeing much mention of climate during the primary, and I think that's to be expected. And as Mike said, we see that similarly in past primaries, partly because there's some other real big ticket items that have captured the imagination on the national scene, whether it's immigration, whether it's ISIS and security challenges and so forth. So it doesn't surprise me that we aren't seeing it right now. But I want to go back to Paris and say why I think, regardless, Republican or Democrat who's elected, this issue will surface. One of the hallmarks of Paris was not simply that you had 190 countries representing 95% of all emissions in the world represented and sort of signing the bottom line, but you had an unbelievable number of, shall we say, parallel commitments. 1,000 city mayors showed up and made commitments to drive towards a low-carbon city future. You had hundreds of companies. You had, for the first time, investors in the finance sector. I was actually in New York yesterday meeting with somebody who's a venture capitalist, and she said, I never went to a COP, a conference of the parties on climate before in my life, but I went this time, and I could not believe how popular I was, how many companies wanted to meet with me. And I think what you have is a drumbeat here. We are at a turning point, and this is where I think there's some common ground. It's just I think the Republicans have had a hard time finding it. And that is, a lot of our energy system is antiquated. It is built on, at least our electric utilities, the vision that Edison had 100 years ago. Vertical integration. It makes consumer choice difficult. It makes kind of distributed generation and that rooftop solar stuff difficult. People want choice. they want to be able to have energy efficiency. And folks also want, and particularly industries and cities, want energy reliability. So those are going to be drivers, whether you're Republican or Democrat, and then the question is just exactly what label gets put on those efforts.
And I would also add, Lynn talked about how antiquated the system is out there. That's true. And the reason it will be important for whoever comes into the Oval Office is that the way the federal government, and in many cases state governments and others deal with it, is equally antiquated, right? We have laws that are very single focused on on air or water or land. And in fact, this issue cuts across all of them. You have budgets that aren't designed to sort of tackle this in the right way. You have regulatory mechanisms that are very old, trying to deal with this evolving issue on the ground with very old rules that don't quite catch up. And so I think there'll just be a necessity to have the federal government and state governments catch up in some ways with what's happening as that antiquated system on the ground gets updated.
Help me understand where the common ground is and how this progress is going to be made when we have candidates who say the following things. Donald Trump tweeted not terribly long ago, not recently, a couple years ago, we should be focusing on beautiful, clean air, not on wasteful, very expensive global warming, a Trumpism. Ted Cruz questions whether global warming is real and says, quote, the data are not supporting what the advocates are arguing. In the last 15 years, there has been no recorded warming. When Marco Rubio says in the CNN debate, we're not going to make America a harder place to create jobs in order to pursue policies that will do absolutely nothing to change our climate.
I think one has to lay on the table clearly from the Republican universe, there are lots of critics either of the solution set, that is, it costs a lot, and or those on the spectrum that say there's no problem. At the same time, big universe, I would point to some others. So you've got Senator Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, came out and said, I support the Clean Power Plan. I think climate's a problem. We need to address it. A Republican. You have people like Representative Gibson in New York, similarly put out a resolution. So it's a big tent with a lot of people. Hard to find common ground among that whole spectrum. But what I do think you'll see is at least minimally the sort of thing you're seeing in the comprehensive energy bill that Senator Cantwell and Senator Murkowski have put forward. That's a bill that doesn't have a climate banner, and indeed critics on the Democratic side are saying not climate enough in there. Indeed, I don't see it at all in there. But if you talk to the senators, they say, look, this is a bill that has a lot about energy efficiency. It has a lot about renewables and clean energy R&D. It has elements that are contributing to ultimately a cleaner, better future, and one that's going to result in less greenhouse gases.
What's your take?
I'd say two things on that. One is, to Lynn's first point there, I think as long as we are debating, which is what happens all the time on the campaign trail, the science about whether this exists or doesn't, or what the causes are or not, I think that's not the space where we'll have the productivity that you're talking about.
So no common ground on the science.
Well, and I think it's well past time, and this president decided a while ago to move past that, to move past the scientific argument towards the solution set, right? And it's not easy, but it's an easier conversation about how do you solve these problems that these elected members and representatives at all levels of government are seeing from their constituents every day. And so I think that changes the dynamic when you get from the science to the solution set. I also think, as is often the case on so many issues, what's happening in states and cities that bubble up to Washington is a good barometer on this.
And the private sector.
Absolutely. And so you have Republican and Democratic mayors, county councils, chambers of commerce, CEOs, governors who have long since left behind the science question and are actually devoting real dollars, real time, real energy to fixing these problems, and that will bubble up.
Yeah, let me just dive in there, Frank, and say a little bit more about that. I entirely agree, actually, with Mike on that. If you look at Republicans in polls, so folks out in the field, the majority now say climate's a problem and we need climate action. So to some extent, there's a mismatch between that broad populace and some, not all, of the Republican leaders. But one of the things we've done at the Nature Conservancy is to actually go out and sort of do some testing, say what does the people think and how do you talk about this in a way that yields common ground. And precisely what we find is when you pivot away from is the science right or not to solutions, you actually do begin to build some support for action. And again, it goes back to the sorts of things that you are seeing in the field and on the ground. You are seeing 29 states have renewable portfolio standards. Well, a lot of those are Republican states, and indeed it's Republicans that are voting for those. You see lots of states with energy efficiency standards, and the list goes on and on. So when you get to solutions that sort of transcend what has become kind of a symbolic umbrella, you start to see common ground.
President Obama thought he had some solutions that he would pursue through the regulatory process, which he's done, some of them affecting coal plants, some of them affecting other kinds of fossil fuels. The Supreme Court has just said in the last couple of days, not so fast. So it's not all these solutions are going to sail through. Would you talk about the Supreme Court decision? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but you will be. And the implications that it has both for the current administration and for the next administration.
So,
and for finding this common ground that we're talking about.
Right. Just by way of background, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that they stayed the President's Clean Power Plan, which was this administration's regulatory path towards putting limits on the amount of carbon that power plants could emit, which was the first time in this country that those limits had been put in place.
With a special target or implication for coal-fired plants.
That's
correct?
right. And it gave each state some flexibility on how, with their mix of energy sources, they tackled that problem, but they were all required to get to a certain target. Not surprisingly, that was opposed by a number of folks, but mostly by some governors and attorneys general. A case was brought. They asked that be sort of frozen while it worked its way through the courts, as all of these rules we knew would do.
Were they bipartisan? Were they Democrat and Republican governors or attorney general?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
There are 29 governors that are part of a lawsuit, and I believe the vast majority are Republican governors. There may be a sprinkling of Democrats in there.
Sorry.
Anyway,
Mostly Republican.
what's amazing and interesting about what the Supreme Court did is they have never done this before in the history of the United States, which is they stayed a rule that an administration had put out before that rule had been judged on its merits by a lower court. And when you think about all the rules that have gone out over the course of the last few hundred years, that's a pretty astounding thing. So I think it is a very big deal. I think it will have some impact on, well, first of all, this won't be decided until after this president leaves office. So the Supreme Court will make some decision on this eventually after it winds its way through the circuit court, but that will be in 2017. So this is sort of laying on the plate for whoever comes next, kind of what to do with that. But it matters because that Clean Power Plan is really at the heart of the U.S.'s contribution or commitment in Paris. In Paris, we committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 by between 26 and 28%. And a big part of that was being able to make good on all of the administrative, not just this one, but all of the executive branch and administrative actions that this president has taken. And so if this gets called into question, sort of the ripple effect of what happens at the federal level, how states interpret that and whether they act or not, how utilities and businesses sort of interpret that, has the potential to slow some of that down.
Well, hasn't that happened? You say if it's called into question, hasn't it been called into question?
Well, yeah, it's called into question, but I think some states, right, there are some states who have noticed what Lynn said earlier, which is this is the way the market's moving. We're investing in this direction. We know we're going to head this way. And the truth is, the Supreme Court has already acted a few times on this issue in different cases over the last few years, and has all but said that EPA has the constitutional authority to regulate these, right, these carbon emissions. So I don't think the question is whether you will have a system to regulate what comes out of power plants. I think the question will be how. And so that may change a bit based on this court case. But states, and again, the private sector, many of them are already shooting past that because they know there's a target down the road that they'll have to meet, and they're getting ahead of this.
So I want to offer a slightly different vantage point on this decision. There is no question that this Supreme Court decision was quite dramatic. Indeed, it's my understanding that the court has never issued a stay on a rule prior to a lower court having looked at the rule on its merits. So it's quite exceptional in that regard. The question then becomes, what does it mean for Paris? And during my years at Interior, I was always known as the Pollyanna. So I'm going to put that Pollyanna hat on and say, it is impactful, there's no question. That is, if the rule somehow is altogether ultimately scuttled. But the bipartisan Congress in the omnibus bill just again approved tax credit provisions to drive renewables forward, extremely important in continuing to support the trajectory of investment in wind energy and in solar, which are two big anchors of a clean energy future. So in the very near term, those bipartisan provisions actually are now in place, will continue for some years, and will drive clean energy in ways that are supportive of the ultimate goals in Paris. So it's really not in the very near term if the rule is scuttled, but in the longer term, as we sort of push the envelope of the steeper reductions in greenhouse gases, that an absence of a rule starts to make a big difference.
So there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this notion of common ground. And as Kathy was mentioning when you were talking, she was talking about the Planet Forward project. One of the ways we have oriented the Planet Forward project to get essentially past the politics is to do just that, go right past the politics, go to the innovations, go to the inventions, go to the new things. Private sector is doing them, states and cities are doing them, and you go to an entirely non-political place because a lot of the reason this is being done is for efficiency. It's being done to make more money or improve the market or whatever. So I get that. But when you have a court, the high court, do this, when you have this ideological roadblock as well, what are the implications for the common ground for this next president? Or, if it's that simple, does COP21, does Paris create such a fundamentally 195 nation critical mass that this is quickly becoming history and you will be forced onto that common ground by all these other actors?
So my sense is that we are driving towards a clean energy, low carbon future, to use the policy wonk lingo on climate change. And I go back to what I said at the outset. What was remarkable about Paris, yes, the agreement of all those countries, but equally or even more important was the engagement of companies, cities, other participants, the agricultural sector, and so forth. I would just suggest it's going to be harder and harder for those, and they are mainly Republicans. I served in a Republican administration, but it's going to be harder and harder to resist that economic groundswell. You know, one of the things that really garners support in Republican legislatures at the state level is the jobs theme. You look at how many jobs are coming from clean energy, and not just, by the way, it's not just clean energy, it's new building materials, it's all kinds of innovations that are driving us kind of cleaner, cheaper, smarter. And, those governors, Republican, those legislators are looking that in the straight on and saying, we're going to support this because that's our future.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out, just to that point, that last year in the renewable sector, jobs grew at 20%, produced more jobs than the oil and gas sector. Obviously, the oil and gas sector has been tanking because of commodity issue, but that's where the dynamic growth has been, right?
Yep.
And you anticipate that continues, so that starts to create some of this common ground.
Yeah, I think two things on that. I think the one of the things, in addition to sort of the weeds of what were in the climate agreement in Paris, sent a signal to, in particular, those innovators and entrepreneurs out there that are building this side of the market that you talked about, that there weren't just 20 countries or 50 countries or 100 countries that were kind of the predictable ones that were getting behind this, but pretty much everybody sending a signal that they were putting a commitment on the table. They were going to have very transparent tracking of how they were getting to that. And they had the opportunity every 5 years to ratchet up that level of ambition. And I think what that does is it sends a signal that had been not around before to companies around the world that there's an opportunity there. And American companies want to get in on that market. And so I think what you'll find is the Supreme Court case and what comes out of it will create some bumps in that road. But there's no doubt that I think the level of innovation that's happening in states and local governments, the amount of disruption that's happening around utilities right now around this country, and the pace at which that money and capital will flow into those to grab that opportunity, I think it will be very hard to predict that the court case will slow that down in a demonstrable way.
So I want to jump in and add a little tension into the discussion. We're so common ground here.
Oh, good.
But I've been working on climate change for like 30 years, going back a long time, and really looked at the dialogue. And if you go over the last, the early, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and even into just 5 years ago or so, a lot of the narrative played out as one of sort of costs, punishment, and constraints. That is, we're against coal, or we're against automobiles, or in this against language. And in many respects, that actually has played into, in my opinion, and sort of fueled some of the Republican narrative.
Totally.
We don't like this. This is old narrative, economy versus environment.
Right.
What you're seeing happen is a real shift in that is not just smoke and mirrors. You're seeing a narrative now coming from the private sector that this is about economic opportunity, driving 21st century global prosperity, and that kind of.
Why is the Republican
that
Party
kind of
so slow in catching on to this?
And so I think they've been slow to catch on to this. But I think it's going to be harder and harder to do so, precisely because it's moving beyond just a narrative to the actual realities of investments that people are
It's
making.
also moving beyond just the politics of this to the economics of it, which is it's a better place to have that argument in many cases, right? So to Lynn's point, while all of this is happening on the campaign trail, what happens in the Supreme Court, the Congress, led by Republicans right now, just passed some of the biggest economic incentives possible to drive that market in the form of these tax credits. And, so progress can happen in the midst of that chaos where, there's not a lot of legislating happening on Capitol Hill, but at those moments at the end of sessions and some other key times, deals get struck, and these are the kinds of deals that get struck.
It's almost sometimes what you wish the politicians had a disclaimer that they walked around with saying, now don't listen to what I'm about to say, but because they say these things,
Right.
and then they cut these in. Let's do a couple more things, and then I'd like to open up to the floor. What then and how should the next president engage the next Congress to keep this moving on a policy level while all these other wonderful forces are at work?
Well, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican president, I think you're probably still going to have a significant number of Republicans, majority on the House side and not quite as clear on the Senate side, but nonetheless, it's going to be a pretty strong Republican situation on the Hill. And so that means if you're a Democrat, you are going to need to emphasize and drive, I think, those economic opportunity messages. You are going to need to look at things that are not unlike the tax credits, things that sort of drive innovation, support innovation. If you're going to spread out the policy tools to advance this.
Creating economic incentives.
Creating economic incentives that drive
How about regulatory?
that drive the agenda forward.
regulatory likely to continue to run into
Well,
serious
I think just through political dynamics, I mean, partly it depends on the regulatory design. There's certainly one of the refrains in the Clean Power Plan is by Republicans is that of overreach, telling the states not just what to do at this individual power plant like you used to do for old pollution issues, but rather talking about sort of what kind of fuels you can use and things that are not really just directly about that. So it's overreach. So you're going to have to be smart, try to do those things that are perhaps as consistent as possible with traditional tools, but drive this agenda.
Mike, next president in Congress?
Yeah, I would say a few things. I would echo Lynn's comment about, the federal purse is small and shrinking on this. Anytime kind of climate is attached to potential funds in any president's budgets, they kind of become, because of this debate in Congress and elsewhere, kind of have the scarlet letter on them. So I think not focusing so
Nothing
much
to do with me.
the federal, the federal dollars, but think about how you unlock some of that investment and capital to move on the private side is key. I also think people would be wise to look at what's been happening on the energy bill in the Senate as places, sort of topics where there is common ground. So that's around infrastructure, where utilities and businesses, again, will demand that Washington does something around modernizing the grid that we have to deliver this energy, whatever the rules might be. There always is some level of bipartisan agreement around energy efficiency, whether that's in buildings or in any other kind of sector. And then I would argue something that Lynn and I have both done a lot of work on, that we're talking all about kind of the mitigation side of climate right now. There's a lot around building the resilience of cities and states and businesses and this country to those impacts, regardless of how we get them. And there is a lot of common ground. You look at state legislatures and city councils again, there's a lot of work happening around that, and I would think we could make a ton of progress, regardless of party, around that.
To add in another dimension relating to resilience, Hank Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary under G.W. Bush, teamed up with some others and came out with a report called Risky Business. And it's fundamentally looking at what are the costs of not addressing this problem? What are the effects to industry productivity, to agriculture, et cetera, by not acting? And I think you're seeing more of that refrain too. Now, of course, some people push back and say, oh, well, yes, the temperature's changing, but it isn't to do with climate change and mankind. But nonetheless, you're seeing more of that argument that is pushing some people into the mix for solution searches.
One or two more, and then we'll go to the audience. But before I go to the audience for questions, I want to go to the audience for an answer. A quick moment of Trivial Pursuit. And to the winner goes, I think you're giving away 2 years of free tuition at the Trachtenberg School. I could be wrong about that. Who can tell me who George Shultz is? Political party? Right. So, very good. He gets 2 years at the Trachtenberg School. That's a great thing. George Shultz wrote in March of 2015, and you know this piece well, and he actually called for common ground in his very, very brilliantly written op-ed piece that he wrote at the time. He cited the Montreal Protocol, which was negotiated during his time in office. I was covering the White House at the time, so I remember that very well. I'm dating myself. I was a kindergarten correspondent at the time. But at the end of his piece, he writes, a carbon tax, starting small, escalating to a significant level on legislated schedule, would do the trick. What are the chances the next president, or that common ground includes a carbon tax?
My crystal ball when it comes to the Congress is always very blurry. But there are those, not only George Shultz, but really in a common ground bipartisan way, that argue, first of all, that one of the best tools for driving towards a clean energy, low carbon future is in fact carbon pricing, and a carbon tax is one vehicle. One of the appeals potentially on the Republican side is, of course, very significant concern about the current corporate tax structure in this country. among the highest in the world, certainly among the highest with our global economic competitors. And there are those who suggest sort of a trading out, driving a carbon tax something bad, and lower corporate tax rates in exchange, a kind of a package that has the potential to pull in industry support, who are burdened by that corporate tax rate, pull in some conservatives that are sort of budget hawks, and wouldn't want to just lower those corporate tax rates without making sure that you're still sort of trying to balance the budget. So there's some prospect there, but again, I think the politics still are quite difficult on the Hill for action.
A few things. I would say, this is one case where I think Paris will move us and others towards that direction for this reason. We have not spent a lot of time talking about sort of markets that these climate rules and executive actions kind of push us towards. But both around the world and in states and regions in this country, there are really active carbon markets already in place and functioning, quite successful. And they all get at this notion that Lynn talks about in terms of putting a price on carbon and letting that drive investments or disinvestments. And companies are doing that in a big way, but so are public institutions as well. And I think that will proliferate under any scenario. And I think, at the end of the day, what these companies in particular really want is certainty. And I think what they don't want is 10 or 20 or 30 different market schemes around this country. And I think whether it's a carbon tax or it's some other kind of universal way of incentivizing or disincentivizing that, there will be a chorus of folks that will want to get behind something there, because I think the proliferation of different schemes is kind of the worst nightmare for a lot of corporate actors. And now, whether that happens in the next few years for the next president, my crystal ball is as blurry as Lynn's, but I would bet that it doesn't happen in the first part of a next president's term. It's one of those things that if it happens, it will happen at the end of a session of Congress as part of a bigger deal, maybe around corporate tax, maybe around something else.
It's the grand carbon bargain, right?
Yeah.
If you could actually do that. Let's go to some of your questions, and don't be bashful, and blast it out. Do we have microphones wandering around? If you could stand, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Yamwa, and I work for Bechtel Corporation. So we do a lot of things in oil and gas, nuclear, and whatnot. Now, I would like to get back to the point of regulation, because I'm in a sustainability business. I have tried some of these things that are happening. And, when I go into meetings with some of these customers, be it Chevron to some of these wind companies, because they hire us to build things for them on a massive scale. It's surprising that when this CPP happened, I could tell that, yeah, truly, beneath it, there are things happening. But when we were talking to some of these companies in terms of what is your next agenda, what is your plan, most of them silently were counting on this CPP, because that was going to give them certainty into sort of acting more and driving more investment. And so when I heard this 2 days ago, the Supreme Court did this, the first night I started making calls, like, what do you think is going to happen? Because some of them were worried that as this thing goes down, the rabbit hole, then you're going to see customers pulling their leg and like, okay, we now have an opportunity to actually just continue for a little bit, and then you see the investment sort of becoming a little bit trickier on that path. And so I know that you sort of said that, let's not focus so much on the CPP and what the Supreme Court has said, because there are already certain mechanisms, and truly there are mechanisms like Bechtel investing a lot in sustainable approaches, because we realize that it reduces costs. And that is true. Unlike just shaming climate, there is a true cost reduction for businesses. That's why many of them are doing it. But the more part of it is in terms of the market itself. They may not be reacting to it, but behind the scenes, in terms of both investors and actual customers, they are worried about the CPP because it was a guarantee of certainty for them in doing business.
Yeah, I think, there are a number of the folks who brought this suit who obviously, disagreed with the tactic or the solution set, as Lynn said earlier, about how you deal with regulating carbon from these power plants. And they were very noisy about their opposition to it. At the same time, to your point, almost to a state, they were getting to work trying to put together their plan because they could tell this is where the market was headed. This is with some level of certainty where the regulatory world will land, whether that's 2 years from now or 5 years from now or further out. And they want to be smart businesses that are prepared for that eventuality. And so I'm not surprised that that there's sort of two levels of conversation about that, opposition and worry and kind of threats around that, and kind of getting to work on tackling the problem. I think it kind of mirrors what we talked about earlier about what happens in Washington and in other places around this issue. I think people know that whether there's disruption by what the Supreme Court is doing or not, this is where this is going to be headed. It's not whether the U.S. government will regulate carbon emissions, it's how they will do it. And so there may be some tinkering around it, but they will want that certainty, and they want it sooner rather than later because they're trying to make 20-year and 30-year investments in infrastructure.
Anything to add? Otherwise, we'll go to the next question. Go ahead.
I'm Jay. I work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I was wondering if you could speak to water policy. I know we've spoken a lot about energy. I'm focused on energy every day, but finding common ground on water policy, dealing with climate change, or things like the Waters of the United States rule is fairly contentious, and finding those synergies across party lines.
Yeah, water, to my mind, globally, is one of the presents among the biggest global challenges, whether one is talking about water quality, water supplies, its opposite, drought. In fact, somebody once put to me that the challenges we face are it's either too dirty, too much, or too little. Water policy in the U.S. is extraordinarily complicated because as it relates to water rights and water flows, with the exception of, let's say, the Colorado River and a few other circumstances, it is states that actually shape those water rights and make determinations about them. And by the way, very different rule sets between, say, the West and the East. As it relates to water quality, of course, the Clean Water Act really does drive that, and we have had a great deal of investment over many, many years driving towards cleaner, cleaner, cleaner. And then yet something pops up like Flint, Michigan. And I think probably at the federal level, the opportunity for common ground gets to something that Mike mentioned, which is infrastructure. Our water infrastructure is antiquated. Those lead pipes in Flint are not alone. There are billions of dollars of needs to lift up that infrastructure from a grade, D or D minus, depending upon where you are, to something really acceptable to the American public and public health. So I think there's room there. We're beginning to see some focus on infrastructure. I think when it comes to managing water flows and issues of drought and issues of groundwater, that play is going to be primarily at the state level. And now, of course, the Waters of the United States issue surrounds wetlands and wetland protection and just exactly what navigability means and so on and so forth. And I think that's become one of those issues of symbolic import, and I think we're going to continue to see contention. I don't think that's going to be a place where we're going to see a lot of ripe common ground.
Question over here. Oh, one there, and then we'll come over here, okay?
Hi, my name is Noah Van Gilder. I work for the Interior Department. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit more to the federal government's role as an energy and as a resource provider. You've discussed a lot sort of the role of the private sector and of regulating the energy industry and all sorts of things. But of course, the federal government operates federal dams and leases oil and coal and on public lands, and has a lot to say in terms of direct provision of energy resources. I was wondering if you could speak to that and what you think is achievable in that sector.
Well, I'll speak to that a bit. Obviously, when I was at the Interior Department for 8 years, very engaged in energy-related issues of the department. First, obviously, there are very significant continuing roles on public lands for the siting of renewables when we're talking about clean energy. And there have been some really important movements by the Department of the Interior to facilitate that effort. Engaging in large landscape planning so that you're not just sort of siting here and siting there and siting somewhere else really willy-nilly, but really looking at the big picture, where's the best place for siting, but then matching that with some expedited decision process so that you actually get it done. I think there's a lot bigger role for that, and actually commend this administration for its large landscape planning, its work on siting and mitigation of impacts. On the water front, obviously hydropower is an energy source. It's one that has not has been sort of at a static, if you will. So we had a lot of hydro investment 30 years ago, and then a lot of public opposition because, of course, obviously associated with hydro can be some significant adverse consequences. I think some of the same kind of thinking, and in fact we're looking at this at the Nature Conservancy, that is applied on lands to renewables can be applied to hydro, and really looking at larger scale, basin scale planning, asking, well, are there any places where it's smart? Are there existing dams you could power up, but not get any adverse consequences to fish or other species? So I think the Department of the Interior has a role in helping think through what I would call kind of smart siting, smart decision making, thinking more holistically about these challenges so that we get environment and energy and economy.
Want to weigh in on that, Mike?
One addition to that, in terms of the kind of ability with renewables on public land, I think, we purposely at the start of this administration tried to really ramp that up where there had not really been utility scale solar on public lands, and now there are dozens and dozens of those. And I think that's important from as with other industries and other technologies, the federal government being able to sort of test that out from a permitting perspective, an economics perspective, a whole bunch of different views, so that you can use that as a proof point in terms of risk and the flow of capital. I think that has been hugely helpful, combined with these tax credits and some state and local incentives, to really drive what was, 8 or 9 years ago, a very risky alternative to coal, now being kind of at a scale that the private investors that Lynn and I were talking about are more and more eager to run into that space. And I think being able to think about the levers the federal government has to pull to be able to incentivize that and to change the market is significant, just given the real estate that is under control of the federal government.
And I want to get back to the common ground theme here, because one might ask, well, where are the Republicans on these kinds of issues? And say two things. One, when I was in the Bush administration, we actually began looking at this large-scale spatial planning and began to work with the Bureau of Land Management, saying, doing this planning on these tiny, small scales is extremely inefficient. It's cumbersome. It doesn't get good results. And we began that effort, and of course the new administration then built upon it. But the opportunity for sort of a common ground amplification, if you will, is Republicans are often concerned about inefficiencies, red tape, bureaucratic procedures that take years and years and years to get anything done. Well, you sort of marry up this large-scale planning with some expedited permitting, and you have kind of a nice marriage there. People that want that holistic environmental view and people that want efficiency and some expedition, and it brings an opportunity to work together.
Okay, let's get a couple more. We've got one over here, and then we've got a gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Todd Wickersham with Beneficial Results, a consulting firm in energy and environment. I have a question related to the agriculture piece. I think we've been focusing a lot on the energy, and the next phase is probably going to be land use management and agriculture. And I'd be interested where you see the common ground in taking some of the carbon out of the air and putting it into uses that improve soil quality and also have the added benefit of resilience and other benefits for water as well.
Great question.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab, and no doubt Mike will have something to say about that too. Let me just start by saying the Nature Conservancy has a major component of its global climate strategy centered on what we call nature's climate solutions or natural climate solutions. We all know the role forests play in avoiding deforestation in helping to avoid emissions. We actually think the land sector can contribute as much as 20% of the solution set in trying to drive down carbon emissions through smarter agricultural practices, through better grassland management and ranching practices and so forth. A lot of these opportunities, so here we are to the common ground piece, actually present some potential for not only driving carbon benefits, but also in some cases improve productivity, and then in addition, actually additional revenue sources to the agricultural and, say, forestry sector. There are a number of forestry trade associations, if you will, that are actually seriously looking at how can forests play into carbon markets so that those forest owners might get carbon payments. So I think there's a lot of potential there to drive economic benefits, drive carbon solutions, and find some win-wins that should be agreeable to all of the above, if you will.
I would agree that we've spent most of the time talking about the energy sector on this. My comments about Paris and sort of how central the Clean Power Plan is to that agreement, I think the land use piece of it is right up there with it. I mean, I think as we approached Paris, and I left before that meeting in Paris, but kind of knowing how real those numbers were or weren't on kind of our capacity in the U.S. to have healthy carbon sinks, to deliver on our national commitment, was huge. And I'll just say it wasn't an easy exercise to try to figure out where we were on that. So I think the common ground piece of this, as Lynn said, is all around the markets that get built out of that. And I think if you look at places around the country that have functioning, places around the world that have functional, transparent carbon markets, you're watching businesses spring up around both the accounting and the transactional part of that feeds into like California's carbon market in a way that is a really good example of how we could apply that at the federal level. And I just think, again, kind of get beyond party as that springs up for investment and jobs in your own town. It's hard to be against that. And I think when people see that as part of the solution, it will be more and more a part of where people are putting their time.
And on common ground, again, one of the lenses that we bring to this at the Nature Conservancy, but putting my Republican administration hat on, I think is also relevant, is really a multi-benefits hat. So a lot of the things you do to try and sequester more carbon in the soils or in the plants and so forth also have benefits such as reduced erosion, improved water quality, other things that people care about regardless of whether they're really focused on the carbon piece. So again, there's an opportunity to drive those solutions under multiple banners and get buy-in from multiple folks.
Let's go over here for our last question of the evening from the floor.
Hello, I'm Nathan Wittstruck with US EPA. It's been great to hear you lay out the areas of commonality and the momentum moving us forward. I'd like you to think for a second, just if the common ground in the next administration is inaction, isolation, and regression, as could play out. Imagine if a Republican administration wins and the Democrats decide to step back because they were beaten on this as an issue of debate. What do you think how would the international community react? What mechanisms would they have to put pressure? You mentioned there could be pressure from local governments and mayors and governors. What would the international community reaction be in your minds?
I mean, I think the expectation is high right now among the international community. You go to these Conference of Parties meetings, and for a good long while, being an American representative at those meetings was sort of the worst assignment you could draw. In the last few years, it's been slightly better, but I think the expectation level is high that we're going to deliver on these promises that we've made. I think, honestly, just, and this is sort of the least sexy part of that agreement, but just the structure and process built into it, where it's transparent, it's locked into 5-year cycles, where you have the opportunity in a very public way to up your ambition or not. I think, again, the number of countries that are part of that will be helpful in terms of building a level of kind of peer pressure around that. On the other hand, right, you can easily have, given all of the quotes that Frank read about what people are saying, if that sort of translates into how they govern, I think it will fall back to, and you've seen this in cycles for the last 20 or 30 years on a bunch of different environmental issues. When the federal government kind of takes that stance, states and sometimes local governments, but really states, step up and become real engines of innovation and leadership on that. And I saw that. I was at the Conference of Parties in Lima last year, or 2 years ago, where even though some national governments at the time, Canada, for example, had a national government that really wasn't active on this, but their provincial governments were hugely active and driving so much change that most of the people at the COP were paying attention to what the states or provinces were doing rather than the national government. And I think you'll see that, and I think you'll see the private sector demand that, despite the rhetoric, that sort of you don't fall too far off of where those commitments are.
The private sector, which we've touched upon, but is not commonly understood, I'm sure it is in this room, but is a very powerful, influential force in this, and it's driving ahead in ways that people don't realize. Well, let's wrap it up with this. I think this has been a great conversation. I want to read to you, I want you to close your eyes and imagine it's late January 2017, and it's we have a new president who he or she has been sworn in. And I want to read you the story that the New York Times filed the day after COP21. Nations approved landmark climate accord in Paris. Take you back in time a short bit, December 12th of last year. With the sudden bang of a gavel Saturday night, representatives of 195 nations reached a landmark accord that will, for the first time, commit nearly every country to lowering planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions to help stave off the most drastic effects of climate change. The deal, which was met with an eruption of cheers and ovations from thousands of delegates gathered from around the world, represents a historic breakthrough on an issue that has foiled decades of international efforts to address climate change. It's written as a triumphant moment. It's written, in a sense, as a one-way street, in the sense that the international consensus was so powerful. Is common ground in that next White House? You can open your eyes now. It's still late January 2017. Is common ground inevitable, or is that scenario possible?
You go first. I would say that that decision in Paris was momentous. The author of that article got it right. But it was just a moment in what has been a building trajectory. And much of what we've been talking about is, regardless of the specific building blocks, the CPP being the significant basis for some of the numbers put forth by the United States, that there are a lot of other commitments being made, both at the federal level in the form of continued tax credits that continue to drive renewables, but this efflorescence of activity at the state levels, transformation of grid systems, company commitments. You have a whole array of companies, for example, that committed over a certain time frame to zero carbon emissions. You have cities projecting out that they're going to be carbon neutral by such and so time. And those are not driven by politics in Washington. Those are going to continue. So what we may get with a new president, let us suppose a skeptic president, and let us suppose we have a Hill that is still skeptical, is perhaps not the same set of tools in the toolkit, some shifting, but nonetheless a pressure from the economic sector, from cities, from the private sector to push, push, push in this direction. And so you'll get perhaps a different set of building blocks, but I think the trajectory is there, and I think it'll continue.
I think I have a terribly different answer on that. I would say I don't think anything is inevitable in terms of common ground. I mean, I think we've watched for the last several years where you know, places where you think there will be common ground and that looks fairly inevitable, and it just sort of blows up for a bunch of nonsensical reasons. So it'd be crazy to sort of say it's inevitable. But I agree with Lynn that there is a wave out there that when you transition from campaigning to governing is very, very hard to stop that wave from knocking down the door that you've just walked through. And so I think you may end up with a slightly different mix of tools that they use. I think you may end up with a slightly different pace at which they act on those tools. And you know, any president that comes in realizes they have a bunch of levers. They have the policy and the regulatory and the budget, and they have their bully pulpit to use. And I think some of them, depending on where they come out on this, will use those in different ways. But it does not ignore the reality that there is a wave there for all the reasons Lynn described, that any one of them will find it hard to ignore.
Well, on that note, let's just say that we hope that the common ground, whoever's in the next White House, is huge. And whoever the next president is, hires you both. So thank you both very much. Really.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Frank, and I particularly want to thank Lynn and Mike. I have found this extremely inspiring, and part of it is that I continue to be inspired by the intellect and the passion and the commitment the two public servants have illustrated and exhibited here tonight. So thank you both, and thank you for what you've done and continue to do in this area. I want to say two things. Thank you for coming. If you go to the second floor, we have a reception up there. And I hope you will come back for our second in our series of Finding Common Ground, which will be on cybersecurity on Monday, April 18th in here. So thank you very much. It was just great. Thank you.